My name is Genevieve, and I'm 32 years old. As TechVault's financial compliance specialist, I thought my accounting background would be valued. Instead, I watched Bradley Reynolds, our CEO's son, dismiss me to potential investors. "She just handles the paperwork," he said with that smug smile I'd grown to despise. Little did he know, I'd spent months secretly obtaining my federal auditor's license, anticipating this moment. When those investors asked about SOC 2 compliance during their $296 million decision, everyone's eyes widened as I slid my credentials across the mahogany table. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments and hit subscribe to join me for more corporate truth-telling. My journey to becoming the whistleblower at the center of one of tech's biggest financial scandals didn't start with grand ambitions. I graduated from Northwestern University with dual degrees in finance and accounting, driven by a genuine passion for financial systems and regulations. Some people find these subjects boring, but I always saw them as the vital framework that keeps our economic system honest. After graduation, I landed what I considered my dream job at the Securities and Exchange Commission. For 4 years, I worked diligently reviewing financial statements, investigating discrepancies, and ensuring companies followed proper disclosure protocols. I took pride in protecting investors from misleading information and fraudulent activities. My supervisors valued my attention to detail and ethical approach to enforcement. Despite my satisfaction with government work, the private sector beckoned with promises of better compensation and the opportunity to help shape compliance from the inside rather than enforce it from the outside. When a recruiter approached me about a position at TechVault, a rapidly growing fintech startup promising to revolutionize payment systems through blockchain technology, I was intrigued. TechVault had all the hallmarks of a promising company. Their core product was a distributed ledger system that claimed to process transactions 10 times faster than traditional methods while maintaining bank-level security. The marketing materials showcased impressive partnerships with regional banks, and their roadmap included expansion into international markets within 2 years. The financial press had begun calling them the next PayPal and a unicorn in the making. My initial interviews went extraordinarily well. I met with several department heads who seemed genuinely impressed by my regulatory background. The company culture appeared innovative yet grounded with a proper appreciation for compliance matters. When they offered me a competitive salary and equity package, I accepted without hesitation, excited to help build a company with integrity from its early stages. Upon joining TechVault, I quickly met the key players who would later figure prominently in the company's downfall. Marcus Reynolds was the charismatic founder and CEO, a former investment banker with a gift for articulating technical concepts in accessible ways that made investors swoon. He had founded TechVault after allegedly identifying inefficiencies in traditional payment infrastructures during his banking career. In our early interactions, Marcus struck me as brilliant, if somewhat overconfident. His son Bradley Reynolds served as the chief operating officer, despite being only 28 and having limited relevant experience. While Marcus had at least built a career in finance before founding TechVault, Bradley's primary qualification seemed to be his last name. He had dropped out of an MBA program to join his father's company and carried himself with an entitlement that made many employees uncomfortable. Amelia Davidson, our chief technology officer, was different. With 15 years of software development experience and multiple successful products to her name, she brought genuine expertise to her role. Amelia treated me with respect from day one, understanding that technical innovation means nothing if the company fails compliance requirements. Jackson Wright led our marketing department with creativity and enthusiasm. Unlike Bradley, Jackson earned his position through demonstrated talent in previous startups. He became one of my few allies at TechVault, often seeking my input to ensure marketing materials made no exaggerated claims that might trigger regulatory scrutiny. Another colleague worth mentioning was Sophia Kim in the engineering department. Like me, Sophia often found her contributions minimized despite her essential role in security implementation. We bonded over lunch breaks, sharing experiences of being undervalued in a male-dominated company culture that grew increasingly toxic. My first 6 months at TechVault were promising. I established comprehensive compliance protocols, created documentation systems, and worked closely with various departments to ensure our operations met industry standards. Marcus occasionally praised my work in all-hands meetings, and I genuinely believed I had found a place where I could contribute meaningfully. Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs sooner. Bradley began excluding me from strategic meetings where financial projections were discussed. Documents requiring my review would arrive with unreasonably tight deadlines. Questions about certain accounting practices were deflected or answered with irritation. As I handled the day-to-day compliance matters, I began noticing small discrepancies. Revenue projections seemed increasingly disconnected from actual performance metrics. Customer acquisition numbers in internal reports differed from those shared with potential investors. The gap between our technological capabilities and what our marketing materials promised grew wider. When I raised these concerns with my direct supervisor, I was told not to worry about big-picture strategy and to focus on my specific responsibilities. When I persisted, Bradley called me into his office and accused me of overstepping my role. "We have financial analysts for projections," he said dismissively. "Your job is to keep us compliant with existing operations, not question our growth strategy." That conversation marked a turning point in my TechVault experience. I began documenting everything, keeping meticulous records of communications and copies of reports before and after revisions. I wasn't planning to become a whistleblower yet, but my SEC training had taught me the importance of documentation when something doesn't feel right. As my unease grew, so did TechVault. The company expanded from 40 employees to over 120 in just 18 months. We moved to luxurious new offices in the financial district. Marcus appeared on business news programs talking about revolutionizing global payment systems. Bradley began attending exclusive industry conferences, presenting himself as a visionary executive. All this growth required capital, and that brings me to the events that would ultimately expose the truth behind TechVault's gleaming facade. TechVault's rapid growth had caught the attention of major players in the venture capital world. What had begun as a promising startup was now positioning itself as the next big disruptor in financial technology. Business publications featured Marcus in their entrepreneurs to watch lists, and industry conferences eagerly booked him for keynote speeches. From the outside, our trajectory seemed unstoppable. Inside the company, however, the atmosphere grew increasingly pressurized. Marcus announced during an all-hands meeting that we were preparing for a Series C funding round targeting $296 million, a figure that would value the company at over $1 billion and officially grant us unicorn status. The entire office erupted in applause, but I felt a knot forming in my stomach. "This funding will take us to international markets and position us for an IPO within 18 months, Marcus proclaimed confidently. "Everyone needs to bring their A game for the investor presentations next quarter." The pressure affected every department. Engineers worked around the clock to add features that had been promised but not yet developed. Marketing created elaborate presentations, showcasing partnerships that were still in preliminary discussion stages. The sales team scrambled to close deals that could improve our quarterly numbers. As for me, I found myself increasingly sidelined despite the critical nature of compliance in any major funding round. Bradley took the financial compliance reports I'd prepared and presented them as his work in executive meetings. When I created a detailed regulatory roadmap for our international expansion, he removed my name from the document before sharing it with the board. "The investors don't need to hear from every department head," Bradley told me when I asked about my role in the upcoming presentations. "Dad and I will handle the financial and compliance portions. Just make sure all the paperwork is in order." The situation worsened when I discovered I'd been excluded from key preparation meetings for the investor presentations. I only learned about these sessions when Jackson mentioned them in passing, assuming I'd been invited. "They've been marathon sessions," he said. "Marcus and Bradley have been revising all our projections upward. The deck they're putting together shows us breaking even next quarter and achieving profitability 6 months after that. This information startled me. Based on our current burn rate and revenue, profitability was at least 18 months away, possibly longer. When I reviewed our most recent financial reports, nothing indicated such dramatic improvement on the horizon. My concerns deepened when I accidentally received an email containing investor presentation drafts that were meant for the executive team only. The attachment revealed financial projections that bore little resemblance to our internal figures. Customer acquisition costs were reported at 40% lower than our actual numbers. Revenue growth was projected at triple our current trajectory without any explanation for this dramatic improvement. I immediately drafted a detailed analysis of the discrepancies and scheduled a meeting with Marcus. His assistant canceled it twice before finally allowing a 15-minute slot on his calendar. When we met, Marcus glanced at my report for barely 30 seconds. "These are stretch goals, Genevieve," he said with a dismissive wave. "Investors understand the game. We show them the potential and they fund the vision." "But some of these numbers aren't ambitious projections," I countered. "They're presented as current metrics, and they don't match our actual performance." Marcus's expression hardened. "The financial strategy is not your department. Your job is to ensure we're compliant with current regulations, not to question our approach to investors." I left his office feeling deeply uncomfortable. That weekend, I couldn't shake my concern, so I returned to the office to review all our financial documentation. With most employees away, I could thoroughly examine reports without interruption or explanation. What I found confirmed my worst fears. The discrepancies weren't limited to future projections. Historical performance data had been selectively presented to create an illusion of more consistent growth. Technical limitations that affected our ability to scale had been minimized or omitted entirely. Most concerning, the status of our regulatory compliance for international markets was grossly misrepresented. This last point was particularly alarming given my role. According to the investor materials, we had either obtained or were in the final stages of obtaining all necessary compliance certifications, including SOC 2, which is crucial for any financial technology company handling sensitive TPO data. In reality, our SOC 2 compliance process had barely begun, and preliminary audits had identified significant security issues that would take months to address. As I compiled evidence of these discrepancies, I remembered a decision I'd made months earlier out of personal professional development interest. After noticing the first troubling signs at TechVault, I had enrolled in an intensive federal auditor certification program, completing coursework during evenings and weekends. This credential would give my compliance assessments more weight and expand my career options if I needed to leave TechVault. By coincidence, I had completed my final certification requirements the previous week, and my official federal auditor's license arrived in the mail that Saturday. As I held the credential in my hand, staring at my name embossed on the official documentation, I realized it might serve a purpose sooner than I had anticipated. The major investor meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. Representatives from 5 top-tier venture capital firms would be attending, potentially committing hundreds of millions of dollars based partly on information I now knew to be misleading. I spent Sunday organizing my evidence and preparing for what might become the most important decision of my professional life. Monday morning arrived with a sense of inevitability. The investor meeting was scheduled at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel in their exclusive 42nd floor conference center, a space specifically designed for high-stakes business negotiations. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city, while the gleaming mahogany table and plush leather chairs signaled success and stability. I dressed carefully in a conservative navy suit, a deliberate choice that projected professionalism rather than seeking attention. My federal auditor's license was tucked discreetly in my portfolio alongside copies of the documentation I had compiled over the weekend. I wasn't sure what I would do with these materials, but having them provided a small sense of security. The TechVault executive team assembled in the lobby 30 minutes before the investors were due to arrive. Marcus paced energetically, reviewing his presentation notes while occasionally stopping to adjust his custom-tailored suit or check his reflection in the mirrored wall. Bradley stood nearby, fidgeting with his platinum cufflinks, a recent purchase he had bragged about in the office. Amelia reviewed technical diagrams on her tablet, while Jackson arranged marketing materials at each seat around the table. "Remember, everyone, this is the big one," Marcus announced to our small group. "We present a unified front. Any questions should be directed to either Bradley or me. Stick to your rehearsed talking points if called upon." His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than the others. "Genevieve, you're here primarily as a resource if specific compliance questions come up. Otherwise, just observe." I nodded politely, while mentally noting that I hadn't received any rehearsed talking points since I'd been excluded from the preparation meetings. The elevator chimed and our visitors arrived. Eleanor Montgomery led the delegation as the principal investor from Sequoia Capital. Her reputation for identifying unicorn startups was legendary, but so was her thoroughness and due diligence. She had gray-streaked dark hair, pulled back in a precise bun, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen every trick in the startup playbook. Behind her came Richard Chen, a partner at Andreessen Horowitz, known for his analytical approach to investment opportunities. His background in both software development and financial analysis made him particularly dangerous to companies with more style than substance. He carried a slim laptop and a notebook filled with colored tabs. Thomas Blackwell from Highland Capital Partners completed the trio of major players. An industry veteran with over 20 years of venture capital experience, he specialized in fintech investments and was rumored to have an almost supernatural ability to detect exaggerated claims. His salt and pepper beard and casual attire belied his reputation for asking the most penetrating questions. Several associates and analysts accompanied these partners, bringing the investor contingent to 8 people total. As introductions were made, I observed the practiced confidence with which Marcus greeted each person, the way he established immediate rapport through personalized comments about their recent investments or professional accomplishments. He was undeniably skilled at creating connection and trust. Once everyone was seated, Marcus began his presentation with a compelling overview of the global payment infrastructure problems TechVault aimed to solve. His delivery was flawless as he walked through the limitations of existing systems and the breakthrough advantages our blockchain-based solution supposedly offered. Slides featuring impressive graphics and carefully selected metrics supported his narrative of disruption and opportunity. Bradley followed with a presentation on operational achievements and growth metrics. I watched carefully as he shared figures I knew to be selectively curated or outright fabricated. He presented our customer acquisition cost as $42 when the actual figure was closer to $70. He claimed our customer retention rate was 91% when internal reports showed 73%. Most egregiously, he projected revenue growth of 230% in the coming year, without acknowledging the technical limitations that made such growth virtually impossible. After the main presentations, Marcus invited each executive to introduce themselves and their departments. When my turn came, Bradley stepped in before I could speak. "This is Genevieve Anderson, who handles our paperwork and compliance documentation," he said, with a dismissive gesture. "She ensures we check all the regulatory boxes." The reduction of my role to paperwork stung, but I maintained a professional smile as I briefly stated my background and responsibilities. I noticed Eleanor Montgomery making a note when I mentioned my SEC experience. The initial round of questions focused on technology and market potential. Amelia fielded technical inquiries expertly, neither overpromising nor revealing the significant challenges I knew our development team was facing. Jackson handled marketing questions with his usual charm, though I noticed he carefully avoided making specific claims about current partnerships. Throughout these exchanges, I observed subtle inconsistencies between what was being said and what I knew to be true. When Richard Chen asked about our payment processing capacity, Bradley claimed we could handle 10,000 transactions per second, though our most recent stress test had topped out at 3,000 before encountering significant errors. When Thomas Blackwell inquired about our security infrastructure, Marcus referenced military-grade encryption and unhackable blockchain architecture terms that our security team had specifically asked marketing not to use because they were misleading. As the meeting progressed, my anxiety grew. The investors were making notes, asking follow-up questions, and generally appearing impressed by TechVault's presentation. They were considering investing $296 million based on information that ranged from exaggerated to fraudulent. If the funding went through, thousands of people would eventually be affected when reality failed to match these promises. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Speaking up would likely cost me my job and potentially make me a target for retaliation. Marcus and Bradley had significant connections in the industry and could make it difficult for me to find another position. Staying silent, however, would make me complicit in what increasingly appeared to be securities fraud. I thought about my former colleagues at the SEC, about the cases we had investigated where investors lost millions because someone who saw the warning signs chose to remain silent. I thought about my professional ethics and the responsibility that came with my expertise and position. As I sat wrestling with this internal conflict, Thomas Blackwell shifted the conversation toward a topic I had been dreading. "Let's talk about your regulatory compliance," he said, looking directly at Bradley. "Your materials indicate you're ready for international expansion within 6 months. What's your current status with the necessary certifications and regulatory approvals?" Bradley's confident smile flickered for just a moment before he launched into a response that I knew contained multiple falsehoods. The moment of decision I had been anticipating was rapidly approaching. The meeting broke for lunch around noon, with a lavish spread laid out in an adjacent room. While the investors mingled with our executive team, I hung back organizing my thoughts and considering my options. I found myself standing near a tall potted plant that partially obscured me from view when Marcus and Bradley stepped nearby, speaking in hushed but intense tones. "They're digging deeper than we expected," Bradley said, anxiety evident in his voice despite his attempt to appear casual. "Blackwell keeps circling back to compliance issues." Marcus straightened his tie and responded with calculated calm. "Just stick to the adjusted numbers we discussed. We only need to convince them long enough to secure the funding. Once we have the capital, we can accelerate development to meet those projections. And if they ask for specific documentation on the SOC 2 compliance," Bradley asked. "Tell them it's in the final certification stage," Marcus replied. "If pressed, say the auditors are still preparing their final report. No one's going to withdraw over a paperwork delay when the technology and market opportunity are this compelling." I remained motionless, scarcely breathing as I absorbed the calculated deception being planned. This wasn't a case of ambitious projections or optimistic timelines. They were deliberately misrepresenting fundamental aspects of the company's regulatory status to secure investment under false pretenses. As they moved away, Jackson approached with 2 glasses of water, offering me one. "You look like you could use this," he said quietly. "Thanks," I replied, accepting the glass. "Have you been listening to their presentations?" Jackson glanced around before responding. "Yes, and I've been making mental notes of all the claims I'll need to somehow justify in our marketing materials afterward." He hesitated, then added, "The revenue projections they're sharing. They're not just ambitious, Genevieve. They're impossible given our current product limitations." "I know," I said simply. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his expression revealing he understood the ethical dilemma I faced. Before I could answer, we were called back to the conference room for the afternoon session. The atmosphere had subtly shifted. The investors, initially impressed by the morning's polished presentations, now appeared more focused and critical. Eleanor Montgomery had removed her suit jacket and had a spreadsheet open on her tablet. Richard Chen had organized several pages of notes with specific questions marked. Thomas Blackwell initiated this round with pointed inquiries about customer churn rates and cost structures. Bradley provided answers that danced around the actual figures, using industry jargon to obscure the reality. I watched the investors exchange glances as they made notes. Richard Chen then focused on the technical scalability claims. "Your materials state your system can handle 10,000 transactions per second, but industry benchmarks for similar blockchain implementations typically max out at 3,000 to 4,000. What specific innovations have you implemented to achieve this performance leap?" Amelia began answering cautiously, explaining some genuine innovations our team had developed, but Bradley interrupted her before she could address the limitations. Our proprietary consensus algorithm creates efficiency gains that traditional blockchain implementations can't match, he stated, with unwarranted confidence. We've essentially solved the blockchain trilemma of security, decentralization, and scalability. I noticed Amelia's subtle wince at this gross oversimplification and exaggeration. Our system had made incremental improvements, but certainly hadn't solved this fundamental challenge that had eluded the entire industry. The tension in the room continued to escalate as the investors pressed harder on specific claims and received increasingly evasive answers. Marcus attempted to steer the conversation back to market opportunity and potential returns, but Eleanor Montgomery firmly redirected to operational questions. Finally, Thomas Blackwell raised the critical issue. Let's discuss your compliance certifications in detail. Your materials reference SOC 2 compliance as achieved, which would be essential for handling financial data at the scale you're projecting. Can you walk us through your compliance status and certification timeline? Bradley cleared his throat and launched into what I immediately recognized as a completely fabricated narrative. We've completed the SOC 2 Type 1 audit with excellent results, and we're in the final stages of Type 2 certification. Our security infrastructure received particularly high marks from the auditors, who were impressed with our implementation of blockchain security protocols. This was an outright lie. We had barely begun the initial scoping for SOC 2 assessment, and preliminary reviews had identified numerous gaps that would require substantial work to address. Eleanor Montgomery's expression remained neutral, but her question was precise. That's impressive. Could we see the SOC 2 Type 1 report? Those typically contain specific control evaluations that would help us understand your security posture. Bradley glanced at Marcus' momentary panic flashing across his face. The full report contains proprietary information about our security infrastructure, but we can provide an executive summary after the meeting. At minimum, Richard Chen interjected, you should be able to share the auditor's attestation letter and the scope of the assessment. We would need to review those before moving forward with any investment consideration. Marcus attempted to change the subject. While we can certainly provide appropriate documentation later, I think we'd all benefit from focusing on the market opportunity and revenue projections for the next 2 years. The growth curve we're projecting is truly exceptional. Eleanor Montgomery was undeterred. Compliance isn't a side issue for a fintech company handling sensitive financial data. It's fundamental to your ability to operate and scale. Without proper certifications, many of the partnerships and customer segments in your projections would be inaccessible. The room grew increasingly tense. Bradley was visibly uncomfortable. Marcus was losing his characteristic charm under pressure, and the investors were clearly detecting that something wasn't right. Thomas Blackwell turned his gaze toward me. As the compliance specialist, perhaps you could clarify the current status of your SOC 2 certification and other regulatory requirements. All eyes turned to me. Bradley shot me a warning glance, while Marcus forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The moment of decision had arrived, and the weight of it felt physically heavy on my shoulders. My career reputation, and possibly my entire professional future, hung in the balance of my next words. The room waited in expectant silence for the answer from the person who just handles the paperwork. The conference room fell silent as all eyes turned to me. My heart raced, but years of presenting regulatory findings at the SEC had taught me to maintain a composed exterior regardless of internal turmoil. I took a measured breath and met Thomas Blackwell's gaze directly. Thank you for that question, Mr. Blackwell. I began, my voice steadier than I expected. I believe there may have been some miscommunication regarding our compliance status. Bradley immediately attempted to reclaim control. Genevieve handles administrative documentation, but strategic compliance overview falls under my purview as COO. I continued as if he hadn't spoken. The accurate status of our SOC 2 compliance is that we have completed an initial gap analysis with a third-party assessor. That assessment identified 17 critical control deficiencies that would need to be remediated before we could begin formal SOC2 Type 1 certification. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus's smile transformed into a rigid grimace, while Bradley's face flushed deep red. Richard Chen leaned forward. That contradicts what we were just told about completed certifications. It does, I acknowledged simply. Eleanor Montgomery studied me with newfound interest. What's your background in compliance assessment, Miss Anderson? Before I could answer, Bradley interjected. Genevieve joined us from an accounting position and has been learning compliance procedures on the job. She may not have visibility into all certification processes. This mischaracterization of my experience was the final straw. I reached into my portfolio and removed my federal auditor's license, sliding it across the polished mahogany table toward the investors. I worked at the Securities and Exchange Commission for 4 years before joining TechVault, I stated calmly. I specialized in financial disclosure, compliance, and regulatory enforcement. Last week I received my federal auditor's certification after completing intensive specialized training. The investors examined my credentials while Marcus and Bradley exchanged alarmed glances. The atmosphere in the room had transformed completely from the confident sales pitch of the morning to something approaching a regulatory examination. Given your expertise, Thomas Blackwell said, would you provide your professional assessment of TechVault's current compliance posture and readiness for the international expansion described in these materials? I had crossed the Rubicon. There was no turning back now. Our compliance infrastructure is significantly less developed than what has been presented today. Beyond the SOC2 issues, we have not initiated the necessary registration processes for operating in the European Union under GDPR and PSD2 requirements. Our anti-money laundering protocols have not been validated against Financial Action Task Force recommendations, which would be essential for international payment processing. I reached into my portfolio again and removed a document I had prepared the previous night. This is a factual summary of our actual regulatory status across all relevant frameworks, with references to our internal documentation and third-party assessments. Eleanor Montgomery accepted the document and began reviewing it immediately, her expression growing more serious with each page. Richard Chen moved to look over her shoulder, while Thomas Blackwell maintained steady eye contact with me. Are there other areas where the information presented today differs substantially from the company's actual status? He asked. Bradley stood abruptly. This is inappropriate and potentially a breach of confidentiality. Genevieve, you should step outside while we address these concerns with the investment team. I remained seated. To answer your question, Mr. Blackwell, yes, there are several other significant discrepancies. With methodical precision, I outlined the key misrepresentations. Customer acquisition costs reported at 40% below actual figures. Retention rates inflated by excluding certain customer categories, technical capabilities overstated, particularly regarding transaction, processing capacity, and revenue projections based on partnerships that were still in preliminary discussion phases. As I spoke, I referenced specific slides from the morning presentation and compared them with internal reports I had brought, providing precise figures and dates. The investors took extensive notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions that I answered directly and without embellishment. Marcus attempted to salvage the situation. What we're dealing with here appears to be a miscommunication between departments. The figures presented represent our targets with the capital infusion we're discussing today, not necessarily our current status. That explanation doesn't account for misrepresenting historical data or current certification status. Eleanor Montgomery responded coolly. Those aren't forward-looking projections. Bradley, unable to contain his anger any longer, turned to me. Your job was to support this company, not sabotage a critical funding round. This is a clear violation of your employment contract and your duty to TechVault. I met his gaze steadily. My professional and ethical obligations are to accuracy and regulatory compliance. Misrepresenting material information to potential investors violates securities laws. My duty as a compliance officer and federal auditor is to ensure transparency and adherence to regulatory standards. Thomas Blackwell cleared his throat. Miss Anderson, would you be willing to speak with us privately to elaborate on these issues? Absolutely not, Marcus interjected. Any further discussions about TechVault's operations should include senior leadership. Actually, Eleanor Montgomery said, gathering her materials at this point, we need to reassess the information we've been provided before continuing discussions about potential investment. Miss Anderson, we would appreciate 30 minutes of your time in a separate meeting room. Richard Chen turned to Marcus. We'll also need complete access to your financial and technical documentation for independent verification. Bradley's face contorted with fury. This is a hostile action based on the unsubstantiated claims of a disgruntled employee. The claims appear to be well documented, Thomas Blackwell responded calmly. And verification is standard due diligence in any case. The meeting disintegrated into chaos. Marcus oscillated between damage control and thinly veiled threats about legal consequences for breaching confidentiality. Bradley made a phone call, presumably to the company's legal counsel. The investors conferred quietly among themselves while gathering their materials. As the room cleared, Jackson caught my eye from across the table and gave me an almost imperceptible nod of respect. Amelia looked simultaneously relieved and terrified. My professional life had just imploded, but for the first time in months, I felt the weight of complicity lift from my shoulders. Whatever came next, I had chosen integrity over expediency. I followed the investors to a smaller conference room, carrying my portfolio of evidence and leaving behind the artificial reality TechVault had constructed. The private meeting with the investors lasted nearly 2 hours. In a small conference room without the intimidating presence of Marcus and Bradley, I provided a comprehensive overview of TechVault's actual financial position, technical capabilities, and compliance status. I shared documentation I had compiled, including email exchanges, internal reports, and the discrepancies between these records and investor presentations. Eleanor Montgomery was particularly interested in the timeline of when certain claims began diverging from reality. Was this gradual misrepresentation, or did you notice a specific turning point? She asked. It accelerated significantly after our Series B funding 6 months ago, I explained. When growth metrics failed to meet the projections from that round, there was increasing pressure to maintain the appearance of success to secure the next funding injection. Richard Chen examined our technical documentation closely. Based on these development timelines, you're at least 12 months away from the transaction capacity being claimed correct. That's consistent with what our engineering team has communicated internally, I confirmed. The blockchain architecture requires fundamental redesign to approach the performance levels described in today's presentation. Thomas Blackwell focused on the compliance issues. In your professional estimation, what would be a realistic timeline to achieve the regulatory compliance necessary for your international expansion plans? With adequate resources and priority, minimum 9 to 12 months for core certifications, I replied. Certain market-specific requirements could extend beyond that, particularly for the Asian markets mentioned in the expansion strategy. By the time we concluded, the investors had filled pages with notes and had requested specific additional documentation. They thanked me for my candor and professionalism under difficult circumstances. We'll be halting our investment consideration pending a comprehensive independent audit, Eleanor informed me. Your courage today potentially prevented a significant misallocation of capital. As I gathered my materials to leave, Thomas Blackwell handed me his business card. The coming days may be challenging. If you need any professional support or guidance, please contact me directly. When I returned to the main conference area, I found Marcus waiting alone, his earlier charisma replaced by cold fury. The room had cleared of other TechVault executives and support staff. Do you have any conception of what you've done? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I prevented fraud, I replied simply. His professional veneer cracked entirely. You've destroyed 3 years of work and hundreds of relationships. We were building something revolutionary and you've reduced it to a compliance checklist. Revolutionary products can be built on honest foundations, I countered. The moment you decided to lie to investors, you compromised whatever vision you originally had. Marcus stepped closer, alternating between threats and attempts at reconciliation. There are ways to fix this. Tell them you misspoke, that you misinterpreted the documentation. We can make this right with appropriate compensation for your discretion. When I refused, his approach shifted. You'll never work in this industry again. Every startup in the country will know your name as the compliance officer who betrayed her company. No one will hire someone they can't trust. Security personnel appeared at that moment, clearly summoned earlier by Bradley. I was informed that my employment was terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct and breach of confidentiality. I was escorted from the building without being allowed to return to my office. My personal belongings would be shipped to my home address. The surreal journey from respected professional to escorted former employee took less than 15 minutes. I found myself standing on the sidewalk outside the Grand Metropolitan Hotel at 4:30 in the afternoon, unemployed and potentially blacklisted in my industry, yet strangely unburdened. The following days brought a whirlwind of emotions and practical challenges. I consulted with an employment attorney regarding wrongful termination and potential whistleblower protections. I updated my resume while wondering if anyone would even consider hiring me after what would surely become public knowledge soon. 3 days after the investor meeting, Jackson reached out via personal email. Wanted you to know that all hell has broken loose internally. The investment group notified the board about discrepancies, and there's talk of an independent investigation. Also, you should know that Bradley's instructed IT to search your email history for anything that might discredit you. Stay strong. You did the right thing. This warning prompted me to compile additional documentation of the events leading up to my termination. I organized my personal notes, copies of key reports and timeline of when I had raised concerns internally. A week later, Amelia contacted me through a secure messaging app. They're trying to contain the damage by claiming you misunderstood technical details and overreacted. I've provided the technical documentation that supports your assessment to the board's investigation committee. I may be joining you in unemployment soon, but I can't be part of this cover-up. Her support meant everything during that uncertain period. The professional isolation and financial anxiety were taking an emotional toll. I alternated between confidence in my decision and late-night panic about my career prospects and mounting legal expenses. 2 weeks after the failed investor meeting, I received a formal letter from the Securities and Exchange Commission. They had received information regarding potential securities fraud at TechVault and requested an interview as part of their preliminary investigation. I later learned that Eleanor Montgomery's firm had filed a report with the SEC outlining the discrepancies they had discovered. The SEC interview lasted 6 hours. I provided detailed testimony about the misrepresentations I had witnessed, supported by the documentation I had preserved. The investigators were particularly interested in the chronology of events and whether I had attempted to address these issues internally before the investor meeting. Media coverage began appearing about potential irregularities at TechVault. Initially, these were vague references to internal compliance concerns that had caused a major funding round to collapse. As the SEC investigation progressed, more specific reporting emerged about alleged misrepresentations to investors. TechVault's public relations team attempted to control the narrative, issuing statements about differences in interpretation regarding development timelines and miscommunication about certification processes. They never mentioned me by name, but referred to a former employee with limited understanding of the company's technical architecture. 3 additional TechVault employees resigned in the weeks following my termination, including a senior engineer who later contacted me to share information about technical limitations that had been consistently downplayed or concealed from investors. 4 months after the investor meeting, I received another formal communication, this time requesting my testimony in the SEC's now official investigation into TechVault's fundraising practices. The situation had escalated from inquiry to formal action, with potential securities fraud charges being considered against Marcus and Bradley Reynolds. Throughout this challenging period, I maintained detailed records of everything that happened, knowing that documentation would be crucial not only for the investigation, but for my own protection. Every sleepless night and anxiety-filled day reinforced my conviction that despite the personal cost, exposing the truth had been the only acceptable choice. The SEC investigation into TechVault lasted 11 months. During this time, I testified 3 times, providing detailed evidence about the company's misrepresentations to investors. The process was exhausting and often intimidating, but I found strength in knowing I was standing for principles that mattered. When the SEC finally announced their findings, the results were sweeping. They determined that TechVault had engaged in systematic misrepresentation of material facts to potential investors, constituting securities fraud. Marcus and Bradley Reynolds were charged with multiple violations of securities laws, facing both civil penalties and potential criminal prosecution. The company itself was placed under a court-appointed management team to protect existing investors and employees while legal proceedings continued. In a development that brought me particular satisfaction, Amelia Davidson was appointed interim CEO based on her technical expertise and demonstrated ethical standards throughout the investigation. When news of the charges broke, my phone began ringing with calls from former colleagues and industry contacts. Many expressed support for my actions, though some admitted they weren't sure they would have had the courage to do the same in my position. "You basically sacrificed your career to do the right thing," one former coworker told me. "I watched everything implode and kept my mouth shut because I was afraid of ending up unemployed." The truth was, my career had indeed suffered significantly. For 6 months following my departure from TechVault, I struggled to find employment. Interviews would progress well until my previous employment came up, at which point the atmosphere would often shift. No one explicitly said they wouldn't hire a whistleblower, but many companies seemed hesitant to bring on someone with my history. The financial strain became significant. My savings dwindled as legal consultations and basic living expenses mounted. There were dark moments when I questioned whether speaking up had been worth the personal cost, nights spent staring at my ceiling, wondering if I would need to abandon my financial career entirely and start over in a new field. During this difficult period, I developed unexpected anxiety that I had never experienced before. Social situations became challenging as I constantly wondered if people were judging me or had heard about my role in TechVault's downfall. I began seeing a therapist who specialized in workplace trauma, which helped me process the complex emotions surrounding my experience. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Thomas Blackwell, the veteran investor who had asked the critical compliance questions during that fateful meeting, reached out 8 months after TechVault's collapse. "I've been following your situation," he said during our phone call. "The industry needs more professionals with your integrity, not fewer. Would you be interested in consulting with some of our portfolio companies on compliance infrastructure?" This initial consulting opportunity led to others. Companies that valued ethical practices began seeking my expertise specifically because of my whistleblowing background. What had initially been a career liability slowly transformed into a unique credential in certain circles. Eleanor Montgomery also reconnected, offering me a position advising her firm on compliance due diligence for potential investments. "Your perspective could save us from future tech vaults," she explained. "We need someone who can recognize the warning signs before we commit capital." These opportunities gave me more than financial stability. They provided a pathway to rebuild my professional identity around the very actions that had initially seemed career-ending. Rather than being defined by what I had lost, I began to be recognized for what I stood for. As the legal proceedings against Marcus and Bradley continued, several former TechVault colleagues reached out to share their own experiences. Jackson had left to join a smaller, more ethically minded startup. Sophia Kim had received a significant promotion at her new company. Even some who had initially criticized my actions eventually acknowledged the necessity of what I had done. 13 months after the investor meeting that changed everything, I made a decision that would define the next chapter of my professional life. With encouragement from several industry contacts who had become mentors and allies, I established my own compliance consulting firm, specializing in helping startups establish ethical financial practices from their earliest stages. Integrity infrastructure became my company's mission, the belief that ethical compliance should be built into a company's foundation rather than applied as an afterthought. My first-hand experience with the consequences of cutting corners gave me unique credibility when advising founders about the importance of honest reporting and transparent investor relations. Eleanor Montgomery became my first client, hiring my firm to conduct pre-investment compliance reviews for her venture capital firm. Other investors followed, valuing the protection against potential fraud that my specialized perspective offered. Within 6 months, I had hired 2 additional consultants to help manage the growing client list. One particularly meaningful moment came when Amelia, now permanently installed as TechVault's CEO following its restructuring, hired my firm to rebuild the company's compliance infrastructure properly. "We're starting over the right way," she told me. "And who better to help us than the person who refused to compromise on integrity the first time around?" The professional vindication was deeply satisfying, but the personal growth that emerged from this challenging journey proved even more valuable. I developed resilience. I never knew I possessed learning that I could face professional exile and financial uncertainty without compromising my core values. I discovered who my true allies were, people who valued principle over expediency and courage over conformity. Most importantly, I gained a new understanding of the true value of pushing paper. Compliance work, often dismissed as mere bureaucratic necessity, stands as the essential guardian of truth in our financial systems. The documents, certifications, and regulatory frameworks I had dedicated my career to weren't just administrative hurdles, but vital protections for investors, consumers, and the marketplace itself. 2 years after that pivotal investor meeting, I was invited to speak at a conference for compliance professionals. Looking out at the audience of people dedicated to the same principles that had guided my difficult decision, I shared the most important lesson from my journey. Integrity isn't just about following rules or checking boxes. It's about having the courage to stand for truth even when you stand alone. What seems like career suicide in the moment can become your greatest professional asset when you find the people and organizations that share your values. The paper pusher had found her purpose, and it was far more meaningful than I could have imagined when I first entered that hotel conference room with my federal auditor's license tucked discreetly in my portfolio. Have you ever faced a moment where speaking up felt impossible but staying silent felt wrong? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the hardest professional decisions lead to our most authentic paths. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need encouragement to stand firm in their principles. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember that integrity might be tested in a moment, but its rewards unfold over a lifetime.